welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us for another instance of our tea break sessions, talking evidence and audiences. And this month we are revisiting our topic from January, which was very popular, about changes in sales, as we can see from Audience Finder data, and focusing on different art forms and giving you an overview of the picture and how things are changing. So just a bit of housekeeping to get us started. We will share the slides after the event, so don't worry about needing to take too many notes. You can review the slides afterwards. And as you may have noticed, the meeting is recorded, so you can rewatch it as well later on, or send it on to more people to rewatch. And we will stop the recording for the Q&A, which should say there will be a Q&A at the end, and the recording will be stopped. So feel free to ask any questions, take part in the conversation. That's what we really value, and that's what we're here for. So I hope you, make sure you get your questions ready for the Q&A as well. There is a transcription option with the show captions button at the bottom if you need transcriptions. And we'll give a short audio description of the various speakers for today, just for the purpose of accessibility for the video. So my name is Elise Boileau. I'm a researcher at the Audience Agency, and for the purpose of audio description, I'm a white woman with short black hair. And presenting with me today is Oliver Mantell, and I'll let you introduce yourself.
Yeah, hi, I'm Oliver, the Director of Evidence and Insight at the agency. And I'm a white male with, well, what's normally blonde hair, but having been indoors in bad weather, it's getting quite a dark blonde. But yeah, that's me.
Thank you. So the format for today is going to be a similar format to the tea break in January, which is going to present you these the change in sales by these different art forms, give you an overview of the general picture, and talk a little bit about what we've seen a bit more in depth in terms of those nuances of the picture, where the changes really lie. And so I think we can get started without further ado, which is just give you an overview of what we're looking at. So Audience Finder data, that is ticketing data that's been contributed by hundreds of organizations across the country. And we've taken a consistent cohort, so a group of organizations that have consistent data in those 3 years pre-COVID we're looking at, 2017, 2018, 2019, comparing it with the data from all of 2022. And looking overall, looking for our art forms. And we have different cohorts for each art form, because we wanted the cohort, or the data, to be representative of the art form as a whole. So we're only looking at organizations that have minimal amounts of data that's uncoded by art form, because as those of you who use Audience Finder will know, each performance is appended with an art form. That's how it works. So we looked at organizations that had quite a significant amount of performances for that art form, but minimal amounts of uncoded data. That's sort of how we found consistent cohorts by art form. So this is sort of the parameters of this analysis that are giving us these results, and that's what we were looking at to see really where the changes lie. And so this is just probably, we can gloss over it a little bit for now, but for you to, if you need the details later on when you're looking back at this analysis, this is sort of the details of how many organizations are included in the analysis for each of these art forms. So last time there were quite a few asks for different art forms to be included. So we took a look at that. So we have here largely the same as last time. We've just removed film because the list was getting very long. And we've added dance, and we've added Christmas shows. So this last pantomime season. We weren't able to include outdoor arts because the sample was too small. Same for opera and circus arts, and same for museums and heritage. But we will make that the topic of a future tea break on its own, because we haven't forgotten about our museums and heritage sector, which is very dear to our heart. is just the ticketing data is not the best place to look at it. Sorry if it's Kama or Kema, yes, there is a good geographical spread of the data. So it's those organizations that are included, it's all over the UK, and they were selected to offer the most representative of a sample as possible. So they're definitely not exclusively big cities or exclusively London venues. There's very much a spread. Yeah, and so these art forms here, the 6 ones here, they cover about 11% of the total number of tickets in the benchmark, which is the total sort of overall picture, not limited by art form. Any questions about that before we move forward? Great, okay, so I think we can move on. And so diving right in, just to give you an idea of what we're looking at, the picture, so this is a change in ticket sales, 2022 compared to that, an average year pre-COVID. So we took the average of 2017, 2018, and 2019 together. So the numbers being down mean that it's a certain percentage down compared to that average pre-COVID in 2022. And as you can see, it's fluctuating a lot throughout 2022. So this is just kind of good to keep in mind throughout the rest of the presentation that we're giving an overall picture, but really it varied quite a lot through the year. And a good way to look at that in more detail, if that's something that you need to look at, that you want to look at in more detail, is to look at our sales tracker, our dashboard that is published on our website. I can post a link to that later. So the benchmark, the overall result is minus 12%. And that is sort of the headline figure here in terms of ticket sales, actually tickets issued in general. It's down 12% compared to an average year pre-COVID in 2022. And that is the main thread. And then we're going to see, we're seeing here how months of the year have affected that, but we're going to see how that is being affected as well, according to which audience group and what they went to see. So I think, Ollie, this is where I hand over to you for.
Yes, yes it is. Thank you very much.
There was just one question in the chat. I don't know if you spotted that.
Oh, thank you. The one back, the graphical spread, I've already answered.
Okay, sorry, got it.
No, thank you, Adam.
But yeah, Elise, if you can just keep an eye on the chat as I'm chatting, that would be
great.
So yeah, I thought this shift through the year was kind of interesting because we've got 4 months where there's less than 5% difference from pre-pandemic levels. And so, for those little windows of time, you'd think, oh, everything's, is kind of back. But even as recently as November, things are actually, quite down. It's the second lowest month. So it is quite volatile, even though we've tried to get this sort of as standard group as possible. So let's see what it says. As ever, do just give them your thoughts and comments or into the chat as well. So some things are doing really well. So we saw before that musical theatre was doing pretty well, and it's now a little bit higher than it was. So essentially back at pre-pandemic levels. Christmas shows as well, back at pre-pandemic levels, pretty much bang on in terms of ticket sales. So for those sort of, I guess, maybe more commercial offerings, that's a relatively rosy picture. For another sort of band of activity, so we've got the rock and pop and hip hop, which we I think previously referenced, but dance, which we've added in. They're seeing substantial drops, drops that are bigger than the overall benchmark, but not huge. So about 20% down. But then for some of those other art forms, and again, we saw this previously, and it's not really got better, not much better, is orchestral classical and players drama that are very substantially down. They're 30% or more down than what they were. So that's the kind of overall headline picture by art form. It is worth sort of seeing what's driving that, because it's not by any means a completely straightforward picture. Now, in many cases, there is now more stuff happening than there was on average pre-pandemic. You know, we've seen a long-term kind of drift towards a kind of slight increase in the number of performances per venue anyway, and across the data set. That seems to now be back playing out across the board for most of these things. Musical theatre is kind of where it was rather than higher. Plays drama is the one where still we're seeing a kind of quite a big shortfall in total level of performances available for people to attend. And so clearly that's going to have an impact, because, you know, with fewer stuff to go to, fewer people are going to be going to it. But then we're also seeing a curious effect where, although and I think a couple of you will have heard me say this in other contexts, but where we've seen concern about which groups aren't coming back, and we'll talk about them at greater length in a sec, it's also about how much people are going if they are coming back. And to some extent, that latter factor is becoming more important than the proportion that are not coming back. So what we're seeing is that, by and large, the number of bookers is bouncing back more strongly than the overall ticket sales. So it's not that people aren't coming, so they're not coming as much, they're not buying as many tickets as often, or, you know, all at once or whatever. So that seems to be, broadly speaking, what's driving it. Income levels, so this is done in sort of absolute value as opposed to inflation adjusted. So this is showing that, you know, income is rising for those ones that are being much more kind of commercially successful, but, you know, is down in line with the number of tickets for orchestral, classical, plays and plays drama. And worth noting, of course, that money is now worth less than it was 3 years ago. So it might be the same amount of money as it was, but actually, or, you know, it might be proportionate to the number of tickets. So the average price of tickets is about what it was, but of course that price is now worth less. This is just adding on a little bit more granularity on some of those figures. So you can see essentially tickets per performance gives you a bit of a sense of, our performances themselves kind of full or empty overall. So we can kind of use that as a gauge for what's driving what. Musical theatre, it's slightly up. Christmas shows, it's slightly down. But essentially, if we've seen Christmas shows, it kind of nets out overall. This is where we can see that actually plays drama, it's the lack of programming that's really making the difference, because per performance, things are doing relatively better than orchestral classical. It's just there are fewer performances. So there's a kind of interesting tension there. And then the tickets per booker, again, gives you a bit of a sense of you know, whether people are booking more often or less often. So the broad picture is quite mixed. It's not as doom and gloom as we've sometimes had to spell out over the last couple of years. It is, you know, this 12% down figure overall, with a lot of fluctuation in and around it, as you can see, and lots of variation for different types of people. So this is, and those who are here on in January will have seen, you know, the equivalent to this, but this is looking at each of the audience spectrum categories going along the top, from the higher engaged, middle engaged, lower engaged in orange, yellowish and bluish on the top, and then the percentage change of bookers for each art form underneath them. So, for example, there are 20%, look at the top left, there are 20% fewer metrocultural bookers for musical theatre in 2022 than there were compared to the average of 17, 18, 19. So that's a substantial decrease. Having said that, musical theatre was kind of compensated by having more dormitory dependables and 29% more trips and treats, right in the middle, and a lot more of the frontline families, albeit that's a much smaller group. So you can sort of see art form by art form, and then segment by segment where the big difference is coming. And there's a really quite clear dark band down the middle of the chart there, where home and heritage, these older rural audiences are really reluctant to come back. You know, at best they're 20% down, at worst it's almost 50% down for various different art forms. So essentially that relatively middle engaged group used to be quite important in terms of arts attendance in lots of areas, is really, really heavily down. And something similar is going on with that second group on the left, community land culture buffs. And that is arguably more important as an issue, because they're such a big part of cultural audiences. You know, they're a really big group, they account for a big chunk of sales. So where you see a third drop in plays drama, I mean, they were kind of the key play drama audience to start with. So suddenly you're seeing a big hole in a really kind of big audience group for that art form. And that's, again, probably part of what's driving those big changes there. So this gives you a bit of a picture. Here we've zoomed in just to highlight for each art form which are the three segments that make up the highest proportion of the audience. So we can see how each of those are moving. So we saw musical theatre, you know, some up, some down. But the middle engaged groups, lots of families, that's a bit stronger. Similarly for Christmas shows, where there's a really kind of quite bullish for those family groups in the middle. But actually they did okay for community land culture buffs as well. So I guess people are prioritising family time over maybe other sort of leisure options in that group. Further down the list, you can see plays drama. You've got three relatively highly engaged groups that did make up a big chunk of the audience there. They're all really down. They're almost a quarter down, or a third down in one case. So, you know, it's really consistent. It's not just one group going missing. It's all of the big groups for that one. So we can see quite a fluctuating picture. And overall, at a very sort of top level, if you look just at the benchmark line, we can see the community land culture buffs group dropping about a tenth. The trips and treats group going up about a tenth, and the net result is that, you know, the overall audience is down a bit because some of the other ones are down, but there's just a bit of a shift really in the profile of that audience in general. So a bit of a shift towards younger families, more middle engaged, maybe more of an interest in slightly more eye-catching or family-friendly programming, less kind of traditional, slightly high arty kind of stuff there. So that's the kind of overall trend in terms of audience behaviour. And what it means is that often when we're looking at the ranking of these segments in terms of how important they are by art form, the trips and treats in many cases is leapfrogging community land culture buffs into being one of the couple of biggest segments, because it's becoming increasingly prominent. So it might just mean that as things progress, those family groups become, you know, increasingly important and increasingly visible. What's nice about being able to look at this analysis now is that we've got this whole of 2022 as a complete set, which also means we can see how the Christmas period played out for family groups, where we had some concerns about the cost of living crisis really impacting on those family groups. But we can see, looking at the Christmas show stuff, that people are still choosing to prioritise these kind of key cultural leisure moments in terms of family audiences, because it's it clearly has been, it's proved sufficiently important to people that it's stayed in there, stayed in the mix. So this is just trying to take what we've got by the different art forms and summarise it a different way, just to be able to sort of see the overall picture. So we've talked about the overall change in tickets, and that's the kind of vertical here. So a couple of the art forms holding up, you know, at or just above previous levels. A number of others, you know, all the others essentially are dropping away, but to a different extent. Plays, drama, and orchestral music, you know, dropping away quite a lot. And worth noting, the plays drama, it's quite a big chunk of the data set. You know, it's quite a big circle there. So there is a sort of substantial drop happening there, but it is relatively localized to plays drama. The other dimension is about the change in the number of bookers. So where we've talked about for some things, there's a tendency to become sort of more thinly spread over a larger group of people. So the number of bookers isn't dropping as much compared to genuine tickets. So something like dance, for example, the audience again is slightly more thinly spread out. Whereas maybe something like rock and pop and hip hop, what you're seeing is a relatively bigger drop in the audience size compared to the number of tickets. So the audience is contracting, but the people within that audience are staying kind of relatively keener. If we then look at the same thing by audience spectrum type, it really flags, well, one thing that really jumps out is that it's not about high, medium, low engaged. So it's not that high engaged people are behaving a certain way, low engaged people are behaving a certain way. It's very much about particular groups of people, particular profiles of people. Where we have relatively lower income family groups and slightly younger groups as well, trips and treats, frontline families, they're doing relatively well, both in terms of number of tickets and in terms of number of bookers. So they're top right, they're kind of like, they're above the north point where the lines cross. There's a bunch of different groups of people who are somewhere in and around that area. So experience seekers, dormitory dependables, kaleidoscope creativity. So lots of groups who are moderately engaged, or they're a kind of substantial part of audiences, but maybe in the case of dormitory dependables, there's loads of them in the population. They're moderately highly engaged. As a result, they're still important in terms of volume, and they're kind of holding steady. So if you like, that's giving us the ballast that's kind of holding things around the kind of, it's not swinging around too much. The big one that's really putting things down is community land culture bus. So it's that really highly engaged, or traditionally really highly engaged, relatively older, a little bit more traditional, really key audience for things like plays, drama in the regions. A really big group, you can see a sort of huge great balloon there, or bubble, and that's what's pulling things down. Home and heritage, it's a smaller group, so even though it's falling further, it's less of the kind of driver. Oh, beg your pardon. So that's the overall picture that we're seeing. There is a pretty straight correlation. You can see they're all pretty much in a line between changing tickets, changing bookers. So one or other isn't radically swinging one way or the other. But overall, we do see a little bit of a differentiation. So a bit of a tendency for Christmas shows to maybe have slightly more people booking fewer tickets than musical theatres at the top end there. But generally speaking, it's a very mixed picture. So although the average picture is that 12% drop, you can see there's loads of fluctuation around that by type of person, by type of art form. We've looked at scale of organisation. You can see that like the mid-scale of organisations tends to be hit a bit harder than the smallest and the biggest. So that's kind of something to note. We haven't seen particularly a difference in single ticket buyers, which is something we thought might be something where people were buying on their own. So it's not so much that happening, but it is a little bit of a drifting out of frequency in some cases, which is what's maybe causing some of the difference. So yeah, so that's what we've seen so far. A bit of a different picture. It's good to know that Christmas has gone quite well. That's so key for so many organisations. You see that huge great bubble there for Christmas shows. Yeah, so that's what we've seen, and now we've actually got the full calendar year in to look at.